In this episode, we begin by making cryptography feel less like an intimidating math club and more like a practical language that security leaders must speak clearly, because unclear words create unclear decisions. Beginners often hear cryptography terms tossed around as if everyone agrees on what they mean, but in real conversations, people use the same word to mean different things. That is especially dangerous when the stakes include protecting data, proving identity, or deciding whether an action can be trusted. Vocabulary is not just about sounding smart. It is about making sure the whole group is solving the same problem. If you can define key cryptography terms in plain language and use them consistently, you become much harder to mislead, and you make it easier for others to build secure systems. Precision is also exam relevant because many questions are designed to test whether you can tell similar concepts apart. Start with the big umbrella term itself. Cryptography is the practice of using carefully designed methods to protect information and communicate securely in the presence of adversaries. Under that umbrella, you will see three recurring goals: confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity, and sometimes availability is discussed as well, even though it is not a direct cryptographic property. Confidentiality means keeping information secret from people who should not see it, which is often what people mean when they casually say encryption. Integrity means being able to detect if information changed, whether by accident or tampering, which is not the same thing as secrecy. Authenticity means being able to verify who or what something came from, which supports trust decisions in systems and communications. A leader who mixes these up can approve the wrong control, like choosing encryption when the real need is tamper detection, or choosing a hash when the real need is secrecy. Clear vocabulary keeps you aligned to the correct goal. Encryption is one of the most overloaded words, so it is worth tightening it immediately. Encryption is the process of transforming readable information, called plaintext, into an unreadable form, called ciphertext, using an algorithm and a key. The algorithm is the recipe, and the key is the secret input that determines the specific transformation, which is why keys matter so much. Decryption is the reverse process that turns ciphertext back into plaintext, again using a key. A key point for beginners is that encryption does not magically remove risk. It shifts the risk toward protecting keys and managing who can decrypt. If the wrong people can access the key, the encryption may as well not exist. When you say encryption in a leadership setting, you should be able to explain what is being protected, from whom, and how key access is controlled. You will also hear the word cipher, which is closely related but slightly different in how it is used. A cipher is an encryption method or algorithm, and people sometimes use it to refer to a specific algorithm family or mode of operation. When someone says a system uses a strong cipher, they usually mean it uses a well-studied encryption algorithm correctly, not a homegrown trick. Another term that appears nearby is cryptosystem, which refers to the complete set of components that make encryption work in practice: the algorithm, keys, processes, and sometimes the surrounding protocols and rules. Leaders should care about this broader view because failures often happen in the system around the algorithm. An excellent cipher can still produce poor security if keys are reused improperly, if random numbers are weak, or if access controls are careless. Precise vocabulary helps you ask the right questions about the entire cryptosystem, not just the brand name of the algorithm. Keys deserve their own vocabulary because keywords are often used loosely. A key is a value that controls encryption or decryption, and its secrecy and management determine how strong the protection really is. Key length refers to how many bits the key has, which affects how hard it is to guess by brute force. Key material is a more general term for the actual bytes that make up the key, which may be stored, derived, or wrapped for protection. Key rotation means changing keys on a schedule or in response to events, which limits damage if a key is exposed. Key compromise means an attacker gained access to the key material, which often forces urgent action like revoking credentials, re-encrypting data, or replacing certificates depending on what the key was used for. Leaders must use these terms accurately because the response to compromise depends on the key's role, and confusion leads to slow or incorrect response. Randomness is another term that sounds simple until you realize how many mistakes hide behind it. In cryptography, random values are used for keys, for nonces, and for other elements that need to be unpredictable. A nonce is a number used once, and it is often used to ensure uniqueness so that repeated messages do not produce repeated patterns that leak information. An initialization vector, commonly shortened to IV, is a value used to start certain encryption processes so that the same plaintext encrypted twice does not produce the same ciphertext. The key idea is that randomness and uniqueness prevent attackers from learning patterns or replaying old messages successfully. Beginners sometimes think any random-looking value is fine, but in cryptography, the quality of randomness matters, and misuse of nonces or IV values can break security even when the algorithm is strong. Vocabulary helps because when someone mentions a nonce or IV, you should immediately think about uniqueness, unpredictability, and whether reuse could cause failure. Hashing is another core term, and it often gets confused with encryption even though it solves a different problem. A hash function takes input data of any size and produces a fixed-size output called a digest, and it is designed so that small input changes produce very different outputs. Hashing is generally one way, meaning you cannot take the digest and recover the original input in any practical sense. This makes hashing useful for integrity checks, because you can compute the digest of data now and compare it to a digest computed later to see if the data changed. It also supports password storage when used correctly, because you can store a derived value instead of storing the password itself. Leaders must insist on clear language here because saying you encrypt passwords is often a sign of misunderstanding. Strong password storage is usually about hashing with protections against guessing. When you use the word hash, you should mean digest creation for integrity or verification, not secrecy. You will also hear about message authentication codes, and the term itself contains a hint. It is about authentication of a message. A message authentication code, MAC, is a value produced from a message and a secret key, and it lets someone verify that the message was created by someone who knows the secret and that it was not modified. This is different from a plain hash because a plain hash does not require a secret, so anyone could compute it. The presence of the secret key is what gives a MAC its authentication value. Another term in this area is keyed hash, which refers to hash-based approaches that include a secret key to produce a value that functions like AMAC. The practical takeaway is that integrity alone is not always enough. You often want integrity plus proof that the message came from an authorized party. Precise vocabulary helps you choose between a hash and AMAC based on what trust you need. Digital signatures are often described as similar to AMAC, but they serve a different trust model. A digital signature uses asymmetric cryptography, meaning it involves a pair of keys, a private key for signing and a public key for verification. The signature proves that whoever holds the private key signed the data and that the data has not changed since it was signed. Unlike AMAC, the verifier does not need to share a secret with the signer. They can verify using the public key. This makes digital signatures powerful for distributed trust, because many people can verify a signature without all sharing the same secret. Leaders should also know the term nonrepudiation, which is the idea that a signer cannot plausibly deny having signed if the private key was controlled properly and the system captured evidence correctly. In practice, nonrepudiation depends on key management and process, not just on math, which is why leaders must connect vocabulary to governance. Certificates and certificate authorities are also frequent sources of confusion. A digital certificate is a structured way to bind an identity, like a domain name or organization, to a public key, typically signed by a trusted party. A certificate authority, CA, is an entity that signs certificates, creating a chain of trust where verifiers rely on the authority's signature to trust the binding. People sometimes treat certificates like magical ID cards, but a certificate is only as trustworthy as the process used to issue it and the trust placed in the authority. Vocabulary matters here because terms like validation, verification, and trust are often mixed up. Verification is checking that a signature is mathematically correct, while validation includes checking that the certificate is appropriate for the use, has not expired, and has not been revoked. A leader who understands this vocabulary can ask whether a system is truly validating certificates or merely accepting them without proper checks. Key exchange and session keys are also important because they reveal how encryption works in real communication. Key exchange is the process of establishing a shared secret between parties, often used to create a session key for a specific communication session. A session key is a temporary symmetric key used for encrypting data during a session, and it typically changes frequently compared to long-term keys. This matters because symmetric encryption is usually faster, so systems often use asymmetric methods to establish a shared session key and then use symmetric encryption for the bulk data. Terms like handshake, negotiation, and parameters often appear in this context, pointing to the idea that systems agree on algorithms and keys before exchanging protected data. Leaders should know that the performance and security of communication depend on how these pieces fit together, and that misconfiguration or outdated choices can weaken protection. Clear vocabulary helps you reason about the flow without needing to dive into implementation details. Finally, leaders must be precise about threat language, because cryptography choices are always made in response to threat models. A threat model is a structured view of who might attack, what they want, what capabilities they have, and what they could realistically do. Terms like brute force, collision, preimage, and replay describe different attack approaches against cryptographic goals. Brute force refers to trying many keys or many guesses until something works, which is why key length and rate limiting matter. A collision in hashing is when two different inputs produce the same digest, which can break trust if an attacker can deliberately create collisions. Replay is when an attacker captures a valid message and sends it again later to trigger an action, which is why nonces and timestamps can matter. When leaders use these terms correctly, they can ask smarter questions, prioritize controls, and avoid being impressed by vague claims of strong encryption without evidence. When you step back, core cryptography vocabulary is less about memorizing jargon and more about building a shared mental model for secrecy, trust, and tamper detection. If you can clearly distinguish encryption from hashing, integrity from authenticity, AMAC from a digital signature, and verification from validation, you will make fewer category errors in both exam questions and real decision discussions. You will also be better at hearing when someone is being sloppy, which is often where risk hides. The goal is not to become a cryptographer. It is to become a leader who can ask precise questions and interpret precise answers. As you continue through the next topics, keep returning to this vocabulary as your anchor, because every algorithm choice and every policy decision is built on these meanings. Precision here is not optional, because security decisions are made in language before they are made in systems.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.